Hello dreamers, welcome back to another Warframe video after a really long break, about 7 months. To be honest, I don't remember most of the technical things and definitely forgot most of the lore, but I know how to ask the right questions and how to figure them out. So let's start learning about Wisp, the new Warframe that just came out. Now because my channel aren't all that huge, I really don't see the point of sharing basic information that you could otherwise get from wiki or bigger channels that many have grown to love like Tactical Potato or Mogamu. So over here we look at the untold stuff, and today more specifically we will be checking out Wisp's third ability, Breach Surge. Simply put, this ability blinds enemy and causes them to produce sparks when you hit them. I want to do something a little bit different than how I used to make my Warframe videos. Before, I would find out everything and then make a script followed by footage based on the script. It takes a much longer time to do, but I find it much clearer. However, since time is not on my side, I decided to record my entire research and make a script based on that instead. So you will actually learn how I think and the kind of questions I ask before solving them. Let's first go into the simulacrum. Whoa, things got really dark while I was gone, it seems. I guess this is what happens when you don't pay your electric bills for 7 months. So the reason I started focusing on Breach Surge instead of her other abilities was the idea of killing many other enemies while attacking just one. But to do so, the damage coming out of that enemy you attack needs to be really high. Since Breach Surge has a damage multiplier that scales with power strength, you could do more damage than the damage you deal on the first enemy. So immediately I try slapping on as many power strength mods and start testing it on enemies. One of my favorite test subjects is the Charger. The reason for this is because they do not have any shields or armor or any auras that could affect the damage, making it a lot easier to understand and break down. Right off the bat, I realized that the dream of killing all the enemies around easily is not going to happen because of the rate the spark is coming out. It is too low for it to be used well on the field, and it only works on one target at a time. Not to mention the spark hits stuff at random and could miss and not hit anything at all at times. Since there's no information about the chance of the sparks being produced, I decided to do a quick estimate by attacking 100 times without Warframe mods and see how many times it sparks, then do another 100 times, but this time with power strength mods, range mods, and duration mods, just to see if they affect the chance and also see how many times it sparks. This is not very accurate by my standards, which is why it's called a rough estimate. To get a better estimate, we need to have a much larger sample size, but considering that this is such an important information to have, I'm pretty sure that it will definitely be released soon by DE. Then we can check with our conclusion and see how right or wrong I am. To do this experiment, I used the Boltor because it doesn't have slash damage, and you'll learn the reason why later in this video. Based on the readings tabulated by shooting an enemy 100 times without mods, we have 36 out of 100 which sparks. And when it comes to 100 times with power strength mods, range mods, and duration mods at 145%, we get 32 out of 100. I guess it's safe to say that the mods did not affect the chance of sparking, considering that the values are really close. And it would seem that based on the 200 sample size, the spark chance is between 30% and 40%. With that said, I wouldn't be surprised if the actual chance is only like 25% and we got really lucky out of this test. But we can kinda say for sure that it's less than 50%. Now based on my initial test runs, I wanted to check the damage and see if the calculations is right. But first we need to find out how much damage our Lateau is supposed to do and how much damage would it do if it's radiation together with the multiplier of that spark. To figure this out, I've made a spreadsheet that tells you all the actual values that you'll see in the game when you do damage to an enemy. Everything is based on the formulas for damage calculation Wiki has provided. If you guys are interested, I'll share this spreadsheet down with a link in the description so that you can use it if you want to. So by inserting all the basic informations, we can use the spreadsheet to calculate the damage and we can compare with the actual to see if it's really calculated that way. And everything checks out just fine. In case you haven't read wiki yet, all the sparks from Breach Surge does yellow damage because it is a critical damage with a 1.5 damage multiplier. But what's interesting is that when you crit with your weapon, your sparks also produces a higher damage. Now the question here is, does the crit damage also get another critical multiplier? Because usually when two crits come together, they will actually add instead of multiplying. And so this is another thing that we're gonna find out. In other words, does it double dip? Checking the values by taking the weapon's crit value, multiplying by the skill multiplier, and then times 1.5 critical multiplier, and we got the actual damage that we see on the enemy. This means that that critical does double dip. So if you have been at my channel long enough in the past, we have discussed before in older videos that the more different multipliers you introduce, the higher your damage is going to get. This means that Breach Surge has a good potential to do more damage with critical based weapons than non-critical based weapons. You may realize in the test run that sometimes a huge 3k damage occurs at the background. It took me a while to figure out, but it's basically the sparks created from other enemies hitting the target. Do not forget that the spark does radiation damage and it has a chance to proc radiation too. Proc chance is based on power strength as well. Having enemies with radiation proc will cause them to attack each other, which could then produce more sparks to radiate more enemies, making the place safer while having the enemies fighting each other. An interesting question that you may wonder is, does the spark damage base out of the damage before or after damage reduction of an armored enemy? Because if you think about it, if you were to do 100 damage to an armored enemy that reduces that damage by, let's say, 50%, you are only doing 50 damage on the enemy. If that 50 damage is used to scale up by the spark, it'll be a lot lower than for the spark to be using the initial damage of 100 before the damage reduction. Imagine if the sparks were to hit another enemy with armor and your damage would be so much lower than what it could be. So in order to test this, I put up two level 15 heavy gunner, and the first target got about 28 damage from the Boltor, and the other target got a 29 damage from the spark. Checking the values with the spreadsheet, then turning the 28 damage to radiation because it's the spark damage, then put it through the damage multiplier and also the critical buff from Breach Surge, I get 29 damage. This means that sadly, it doesn't take the damage dealt on the enemy before the damage reduction, which makes it extra bad versus armored enemies because your damage is reduced twice, and armor in this game is already a little broken. Here's another interesting fact that is not on wiki yet. The sparks from Breach Surge can also be activated from damage over time damages, like Toxin or Bleed. This means that if you want to play your Wisp as a CC by confusing a lot of enemies, using gas procs and bleed procs on an enemy affected by Breach Surge will cause them to keep sparking very often. But another interesting thing to note is that the rate of the sparks flying out has a cap. It is roughly 2 to 3 sparks per second from what I can see. This means that even if the target is filled with, let's say, 100 toxin procs, it will still generate 2 to 3 sparks per second. At the surface, it would seem like this ability works best with slow but high damage weapons, since attacking really fast doesn't create more sparks. And that is what I thought as well until I tested it. You see, although the rate of the spark produced by a single target has a cap, the damage isn't capped on one hit. Let me explain. Here you see me creating gas procs on a target, which then produce sparks dealing damage of 70 and 550-ish. But when I spam on the target with multiple gas procs, the damage per spark also increases the more procs it has, and then slowly decreases again as the gas procs duration ends. This means that the spark damage works like beam weapons. It is not based on your damage per hit, but your damage over time on the target. So this means that having high fire rate weapon is still very beneficial. Not to mention that you will have a more consistent damage output. Remember, if you do a really high single damage and kills the enemy in one hit, maybe by an accident critical, it will not create any spark on that last hit. So the enemy needs to be alive in order for it to generate the spark. I really hope that you guys are learning something from the stuff so far. Now, before I continue with the demonstration and wrapping things up, I would like to mention the synergies of Breach Surge. These are available on Wiki, but I need to share them so that my explanation later would make more sense. When you use Will-O-Wisp and then use Breach Surge, the image from Will-O-Wisp will also use Breach Surge. This means you can affect enemies from a distance. If you use Breach Surge on a reservoir, which is your first ability, you will teleport to it and use Breach Surge that has a double in AoE range, again affecting more enemies. Here comes another cool information that I do not see on Wiki yet. You can actually use Will-O-Wisp and then use Breach Surge on the reservoir to create two Breach Surge that is double the AoE range. One from you and the other from the Will-O-Wisp image. And lastly, this is not a synergy but a passive, which is when Wisp is airborne, she becomes invisible to the enemy. Now the big question, how would I choose to play with revolving her third ability? As a summary, we know that critical weapons works well because of the double dip. High attack speed is also good. If it has DOT damage, it can make the enemy spark more often. And high damage per hit weapons can kill enemies instantly, which will not cause them to spark. So we are looking for a fast, low damage per hit but high damage per second weapon with good status chance for the DOT proc and good critical chance. Considering that Toxin and Bleed DOT can stack and DOT damage like Burn doesn't, the ideal DOT you want to be using is probably Gas, Toxin, or Bleed. The truth is, Breach Surge damage isn't bad, especially with proper modding, but because the damage isn't in percentage like the Soul Bag, and you will need to sacrifice a good amount of mod slots for power strength, just to deal damage one enemy at a time with less than 50% chance of creating the spark, modding it for damage doesn't feel like it's worth it. Instead, having high range and duration might be more beneficial as a CC for blinding and confusing the enemies. Pairing it with Shock Reservoir and Bunny Hops, it will keep you pretty safe from harm. Next, all you need is a good weapon. I recommend using a melee weapon to take advantage of that stealth damage while the enemy is blind. Again, not everyone knows this, but the average gun can't do stealth damage. You could try with Excalibur's blind too, and you'll realize that your damage doesn't come out yellow. Breach Surge's blind doesn't open enemies up for finisher, which in my opinion can be better for your DPS because finisher animation could be quite slow sometimes and it only works on one enemy at a time. However, there are benefits of finishers. It has a good iframe, which is invulnerable frames, which means that while you are undergoing the animation, you will not be taking any damage. Stealth attacks and finishers are both really useful in this game because the damage ignores armor. Let me know what are your thoughts down at the comments. Do you think she is good? Because she is definitely one of my favorite frames to play with right now. I mean, just having to bunny hop and become pretty much invincible the whole time is already pretty crazy for any frame to have in my opinion. Here you see the background is me fighting 20 level 155 heavy gunners. I have chosen to use the dual cleavers for all the reasons we have justified above. It is fast, high status chance, high critical, and also a melee weapon. I modded it with gas and it has slash procs in its stance, making it a great DOT spam weapon as well. That is all for this video. Let me know if you found a better way of using Wisp down in the comments, or if you feel like I have something that I left out and I should add it to the video. If you have a good idea for a video, any suggestions, you can actually go to my Discord and share it over there. If I were to use any of your ideas, you will win yourself a glyph. It's my own personal glyph that is pretty now I'm sure a lot of people that plays Warframe do not know a lot of what I've shared about Wisp in this video, So do me a great solid and share it with your friends, with your clanmates, whoever that has this Warframe or is trying to get this Warframe. Hopefully they'll like the Warframe more and also have a better time playing the game. Until next time, sweet dreams, bye bye.